This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers, that is 2-3-page essays on the themes of Masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 769, entitled, Why is Masculism Critical for Society? Description. This flyer explains why masculism is critical for society, giving two main reasons, namely for the very survival of society and for the improvement of the mental health of both sexes. Now, the flyer itself. Why is masculism critical for humanity? By Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. There are probably lots of reasons why people should think that masculism is critical for humanity. This flyer will concentrate on two of the biggest, most important ones. They are, that masculism is critical for humanity's very survival and critical for the mental health of both sexes. Why is masculism critical for humanity's very survival? Today's monoconscious feminism is indirectly wiping out whole populations. In South Korea, which has the worst relations between the sexes in the world, the two sexes are screaming at each other. 90% of South Korean men are anti-feminist, to the point that South Korean politicians are putting anti-feminist agendas in their political platforms and getting elected due to a block vote by young South Korean men. In the US, 2/3 of young men don't even date young women, according to a famous poll taken in 2022 by Pew Research Center, which showed that 63% of young men between 18 and 30 don't even date young women, claiming that young women were undateable due to being too poisoned by feminism. In South Korea, the feminists hate men because South Korea has one of the worst gender pay gaps in the world, where married women are pushed out of the workforce, and masculists hate women, since women aren't conscripted for 2 years into the army, giving them a 2-year head start in the workforce in a dwindling economy. In the US, young men refuse to have relationships with misandrist, male-dumping, feminazi cunts and choose to live the MGTOW lifestyle to avoid the toxicity of the fluffy feminist-dominated divorce courts, who see divorcing fathers as cash machines to be abused and robbed. Relations between the two sexes are getting progressively worse as each side sharpens its arguments and hurls abuse at each other. Since this series of flyers is masculist, it focuses on the masculist side of the gender political war. Why do masculists have such a hatred of monoconscious feminists and label them one of their two main enemies? Masculists are not anti-feminists per se. Personally, as one of the planet's main masculist theorists, blowing my own horn, I don't dismiss feminist arguments against men. If I were a woman, I'd be a feminist, wanting equal rights and opportunities for women to have equal political power in society so that women are given an equal voice with men. But as a masculist, I have a real hatred of feminist monoconsciousness. That is, the belief that monoconscious feminists, have been brainwashing women and society into, for the past 6 decades, during which the feminists have had a monopoly over gender politics, namely that gender oppression is a one-way street and that women are the oppressed and men are the oppressors. Hence, women have every right to trash men in public for men's horrible gender crimes against women. For example, rape, sexual harassment, domestic violence, patriarchy, misogyny, etc. If I were a monoconscious feminist, I too would probably feel motivated to trash men for the reasons that feminists give. Given feminists 6 decades monopoly over gender politics, it's not surprising that nearly all upper middle class educated young women have been strongly influenced by these feminist, monoconscious feminist ideas, and hence have deep suspicions towards men, behaving in a surly way towards men, or as 2/3 of young men say, US men, are too poisoned by feminism, making them repulsive to be with for young men. Hence, these young women are now rejected by young men in huge numbers, resulting in the fact that now on TikTok and YouTube Shorts, there are hundreds of young women in tears who lament the fact that they can't find a man to have a decent relationship with. So if they want to have a kid, they'll have to be a single parent, having to work to pay a nanny to raise their kid, which rather defeats the whole purpose of having a kid in the first place. Why bring a kid into the world if it's going to be raised by someone else, often of another culture, and a lot dumber than the mother? Masculists have 2 main enemies, fluffies and monoconscious feminists. Fluffies are traditional women who expect to live off the money and labour of a man for decades of his life, thus manslaving him for decades. And for one father in 4, divorce raping him in the hated by masculists, fluffy feminist-dominated divorce courts, who still see divorcing mothers as fluffies to be paid for by men instead of being FIPs, that's financially independent persons, who have bothered to get a career-competent education at high school and college, so that they are FIPs as adults and not, fluffy style, expect to manslave a man for decades. Masculists are abolitionists who have a hatred of fluffies and aim to wipe them off the face of the earth by totally ignoring them, not even pumping and dumping them, thus forcing women to be FIPs or to rot on the shelf, dying slow, miserable, manless, lonely deaths, spat at, utterly rejected by men, both socially and sexually. Masculists argue that it was men who gave women science-based medicine, so that today women have a life expectancy of 85 years. It was men who gave women the pill, household gadgets, higher education. So women today choose to have 0, 1, or 2 kids in most cases. So the masculists argue, now that women can work, they must work. Anything else is manslavery, and manslavery is slavery, hence hated. So fluffies will either fib up or be killed by masculisted men by total neglect. Masculists see monoconscious feminists as hypocrites and genociders. Hypocrites because masculists see women oppressing men far worse, with many of women's gender crimes against men being horrible and lasting decades. For example, the big 3 that the masculists keep harping on, that is, women's manslavery, women's divorce rape, and women's forced fathering. Masculists are usually biconscious, that is, they have had both their feminist and their masculist consciousnesses raised. They are familiar with both sets of arguments, feminist and masculist, so see clearly that gender oppression is very much a 2-way street. That is, that women oppress men too, and in fact far worse than vice versa. So when they come across a monoconscious feminist trashing men in public, they bite her fucking head off, haranguing her out of the room with verbally violent, ideologically hateful masculist rhetoric, screaming at her to, quote, learn some masculism, you monoconscious misandrist feminazi cunt. Learn how much worse women oppress men with women's manslavery, women's divorce rape, women's forced fathering. Learn that gender oppression is a 2-way street, or be so punished by men, masculistic men, that you'll be effectively exterminated by being forced to rot on the shelf, dying a slow, miserable, manless, lonely death. The current polarity between the 2 sexes is so bad that the main consequence is that the birth rate is crashing. Common sense says that when 2/3 of young US men refuse to even date young women, then obviously they're not going to give these young women their sperm, thus crashing the birth rate. When 90% of young men in South Korea are anti-feminist, they too are not going to give young South Korean women their sperm. There are many other reasons why the birth rate is plummeting in many advanced countries around the world. In brackets, for example, the price of housing, the price of raising a kid, the influence of feminist careerism, etc. But given the above stats, the dominant, capital letters, reason why the birth rate is crashing is due to the fact that young men refuse to give young women their sperm. With the birth rate crashing, for example, in South Korea, it is 0.7 kids per woman, and in Taiwan, it is even a bit worse. This means that in a mere 4 generations, South Korea will no longer be with us. North Korea will simply be able to walk into South Korea without firing a shot. But a similar situation is also happening in North Korea, where the birth rate is, in brackets, according to my new GPT version 5.6, 1.8 children per woman, a lot more than in South Korea, but still below the replacement rate of 2.1 children per woman. So the Masculist argue monoconscious feminists are indirectly responsible for the crash in the birth rate due to their poisoning of the minds of young women, making them repulsive to be with for young men, who then reject them, preferring to live the MGTOW, MGTOW, it's men going their own way, lifestyle, by rejecting marriage, rejecting paternity, in brackets, so as to avoid the toxicity of the divorce courts taken over by the monoconscious feminists in the 70s, close brackets, and spending their money on themselves. Thus, Masculists see monoconscious feminism as genocidal, as a cancer that has to be eradicated, and the way to do this is to make society bi-conscious. That is, to teach society masculist ideas, so that everyone becomes bi-conscious, learning that gender oppression is a two-way street, and that women oppress men far worse. Masculists have a whole political program that they want implemented, which goes roughly as follows. Firstly, society needs to be made bi-conscious, then made into a FIP society, so that parents raise and teachers teach both sexes to be FIPs, so that women don't grow up floppy style, expecting men to pay for them for the rest of their lives. Masculists are abolitionists, who see manslavery as slavery and see fluffies as the enemy to be wiped out. Once we live in a FIP society, the divorce courts can then be thoroughly reformed, basing them on the principle of financial independence of both divorcing parties, so that divorcing mothers are seen by the divorce courts as FIPs, who can pay their own way, so that men don't have to be butchered in the hated current divorce courts. In a reformed divorce court system, alimony will be thrown out. The halving of wealth and stuff will be thrown out. Custody of kids after divorce will be made joint by default. The original owner of the house gets to keep it. Divorcing parents get to keep what they came into the marriage with. This is the end of part 1.